The cold came to Amargar the way a creditor comes to a ruined house without knocking, certain of its welcome, settling into the stone as though it had always owned the place and had merely stepped out for a season to let the family pretend otherwise. It crept up through the sandstone floors that had once been warm with the passage of 100 feet. It pooled in the corners where the tapestries had rotted and been sold, and it laid its long grey hand upon the shoulders of the last people who still called the fortress home. In the highest of the cold rooms, where the wind found every crack the masons had forgotten, a young woman sat with a mending needle and did not shiver, because shivering was a kind of complaint, and she had trained herself long ago to make no complaints that no one would answer. Her name was Illa, and she was the second daughter of Raja Jaswant of Amargar, though in the accounting of the household she was closer to a servant than to a princess, for she was the one who was useful, and therefore the one who was never seen. She wore a plain sari of undyed cotton, ash grey, mended so many times at the hem that the mending had become a kind of embroidery, and this grey cloth had become the truest map of who she was, a garment chosen not for its beauty, but for its refusal to draw the eye, a colour that let her move through the dying palace like smoke through a shuttered window. The fortress had been great once. Illa had heard the stories the way one hears the sound of a bell rung in another valley, faint and beautiful and belonging to someone else. There had been elephants in the courtyard on festival days, and lamps in every niche, and a treasury with doors that took 4 men to open. Now the elephants were a memory. The lamps were lit one at a time and carried from room to room, and the treasury doors stood open on emptiness because there was nothing left inside worth guarding. Her father did not speak of the debts, but the debts spoke for themselves in the faces of the moneylenders' clerks who came up the winding road each month, in the silences at the long table where the family ate, in the way the servants who remained had stopped asking to be paid because they knew the answer and preferred the mercy of not hearing it aloud. Illa had learned to read the whole of the household's fortune in small signs, the way a farmer reads a coming drought in the colour of the sky. She knew when the oil was low. She knew which sacks of grain had gone to weevils. She knew the exact sum, though no one had ever told her, that stood between her father and the loss of the last thing he owned, which was not the fort and not the land, but the last thin coin of his pride. Her elder sister, Rupkanwa, was the beauty of the house, and knew it, and spent her hours before a clouded silver mirror, mourning the jewels she no longer had to hang from her ears, and Illa did not envy her, for envy too was a currency she could not afford to spend. What Illa had instead was the granary ledger she kept in a hand her father did not know she possessed, and the herb garden she tended on the fort's forgotten northern terrace, where the soil was thin but stubborn, and the long habit of doing what needed doing before anyone thought to ask. She did not cry. This was the first thing to understand about her, and perhaps the last, that in a house where tears fell as freely as the plaster from the ceilings, Illa did not cry. Not because she felt nothing, but because she felt everything, and had decided, in some private council of the heart, that her tears were the one treasure the ruin could not reach, and she would not spend them cheaply on a fate that was not yet finished with her. So she sat in the cold room with her needle, and outside the wind pulled at the dying banners on the walls, and somewhere below in the warmer rooms her father was signing a paper that would decide the rest of her life without asking her a single question, and Illa, who felt the shape of it, coming the way she felt the change of season in her hands, threaded her needle again, and made one more small, patient, invisible repair to a thing that everyone else had already given up as lost. The paper her father signed was a marriage. It was presented to the household 2 mornings later as a rescue, a mercy, a stroke of fortune so improbable that Raja Jaswant said the word blessing 3 times while he explained it, and could not meet his daughter's eyes even once. A man had come forward, a man of great wealth, from the trading city to the south, a grain merchant grown so rich that the princes themselves borrowed from him and hated him for it, a man named Seth Ratanlal, who had bought a minor title along with a great many other things, and now wished to buy the last thing money alone could not manufacture, which was the ancient blood of a royal house to hang upon his sons like a borrowed jewel. He would take a daughter of Amargar to wife, and in exchange he would settle the debts of Amargar entirely, would light the lamps again, would fill the treasury doors with something worth guarding. It was, Raja Jaswant insisted, the salvation of the line. That it was also the sale of a girl he did not say, because there are truths a proud man will die before he speaks, and this was one of them. Everyone in the cold rooms understood at once that it would be Rupkanwar who was offered. Rupkanwar the beauty, whose face was the family's last saleable asset. And Rupkanwar herself understood it, and wept prettily, and arranged her weeping so that it caught the light. But the merchant's agent, a dry, small man with a ledger of his own, had done his inquiries thoroughly, and word had reached him that the elder daughter was frail of temper and vain of spirit, and would make a poor manager of a great man's household, while the younger daughter, the grey one, the one no one mentioned, was said by the servants to be the true keeper of the fort, sensible and tireless, and without a single expensive want. And so the offer, when it came in its final form, named Illa. Rupkanwar's tears dried with astonishing speed and curdled into something colder. Raja Jaswant, presented with a merchant who preferred his plain daughter to his beautiful one, felt the insult of it even through his relief, and could not forgive Illa for being wanted when he had spent 19 years failing to want her himself. As for Illa, she received the news the way she received all news, standing very still in her grey sari, with her hands folded, and she said only, after a pause in which the whole room held its breath, that she would do what the house required of her. It was not surrender. She wished the room to understand that it was not surrender, though only the old housekeeper, Bhuri Bai, watching from the doorway with her sharp black eyes, understood the difference. It was a decision. Illa had looked at the shape of her life, at the empty treasury and the dying banners, and the sister who would never forgive her, and the father who could not love her, and she had decided that if she was to be spent, she would at least be spent on the survival of something, and that a merchant's cold house with lamps in every niche was not, when weighed honestly, so very different from the cold house she already lived in, except that, in the new one, her labor would keep other people warm. So the date was set. The astrologers were consulted and paid with the merchant's advanced coin, and they found an auspicious morning 3 weeks hence, and the fort of Amargar, which had not seen a celebration in a decade, stirred itself painfully upright to prepare a wedding grand enough to disguise a sale. Illa watched it all from her northern terrace, where the herbs pushed up through the thin soil, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not afraid. She was many things in those 3 weeks, tired and useful, and unthanked as always. But she was not afraid, and she did not yet know that the reason was that some deeper part of her had already sensed, the way she sensed the drought in the sky, that this marriage her father had sold her into was a thing that was never, ever going to happen. The morning of the wedding broke grey and streaming, one of those rare hill storms that turns the red road to a river of blood-coloured mud and drives every living thing to shelter. Illa had not slept, She had been dressed since the 4th hour of the night by women who pulled her hair too tight and hung upon her the few borrowed ornaments the house had managed to gather, and she had submitted to all of it in her stillness, letting them paint her hands with henna in patterns she would never have chosen, letting them wind her in crimson and gold that made her feel like a stranger wearing a fire she could not keep lit. Beneath the crimson, against her skin where no one could see, she had kept a folded corner of the grey sari, a small superstition, a way of remembering herself. The wedding was to be held not at Amargar, whose crumbling halls could not be made grand enough, but at the merchant's newly bought garden estate in the valley below, a place of fountains and imported marble where Seth Ratanlal intended to display his purchase of royal blood before every noble he had ever lent money to. The procession would carry Illa down the winding road at the auspicious hour, storm or no storm, and so at dawn she was led out through the great gate of the fort toward the covered palanquin that waited in the downpour. And it was there, in the last sheltered angle of the gate where the wall met the road, half in the mud and half out of it, that she saw the dying man. He was a heap of soaked rags at first, the kind of shape the eye slides over, a beggar washed up against the fort wall by the storm, the way debt had washed up against the family. The bearers stepped around him without looking. Puri Bai, hurrying at Illa's side beneath a dripping cloth, hissed at her to keep moving, that it was ill luck to look at a corpse on a wedding morning. But Illa had stopped, because in the grey light she had seen the man's hand move. Not a corpse, then. A living thing, barely. A man with a fever burning off him so fiercely she could feel it 3 steps away, like a fire under wet wood. His lips cracked, his eyes rolled half back, a wound gone bad on his shoulder, where the rags were stuck to the flesh, and one hand opening and closing on nothing, as if it were still, in some drowning dream, reaching for a thing it had lost. And Illa, in her crimson and gold, with the whole apparatus of her sail idling in the rain behind her, and the auspicious hour ticking away like water through her fingers, knelt down in the mud beside him. Puri Bai made a sound of pure horror. The bearers stared. Illa put her painted hand to the man's burning forehead, and then to the pulse in his throat, which stuttered and leapt beneath her fingers like a bird thrown against a window, and she knew, with the certainty of one who had nursed every fever the fort had suffered, that this man had perhaps an hour left in him, and that the hour was now, and that no one in the whole wet world was going to give it to him but her. She heard, very far away, the master of the procession calling that they must go, that the astrologers had been precise, that the sacred moment could not be recovered if it passed. She heard Puri Bai begging her to think of her father, of the debts, of the merchant's coin, and Illa, kneeling in the mud with a stranger's failing heart beneath her hand, understood that she was being asked to weigh a marriage against a life, a rescue against a man, a whole future of warm lamps against a single hour that no one would ever thank her for, and she found the scale did not even tremble. She stood. She gave her orders in the plain, flat voice she used for the granary and the sick room, the voice no one at Amargar had ever thought to obey until this moment, when suddenly they did. Bring him inside. Bring hot water and clean cloth and the neem and the honey. Send word down the valley that the bride is delayed. And when the master of the procession, aghast, demanded to know what he was to tell Seth Ratanlal, Illa looked at him through the rain and said, quite simply, that he could tell the merchant the truth, that a man was dying at the gate, and that she was needed more here than there. The marriage did not survive the hour. Word of it ran down the valley faster than any messenger, embroidered richer at every telling, so that by the time it reached the marble estate, the story was no longer of a princess pausing to save a beggar, but of a princess who had thrown herself into the mud after some diseased vagrant and refused to come to her own wedding, a story shaped precisely to wound a man like Seth Rattenlal, who had paid an enormous sum for the ancient dignity of a royal house, and now found himself the joke of every noble he had meant to impress. He did not wait for an explanation. He tore up the settlement in front of his assembled guests, declared the alliance an insult, demanded the return of every coin already advanced, and rode home before the storm had even broken, leaving the fountains playing over an empty mandap and a feast no one would eat. And so, the debts that the marriage had been built to erase came crashing back onto Amargar doubled, the borrowed coin now owed again, the humiliation now public, and Raja Jaswant, who had staked the last of his pride on this single throw, felt the whole edifice of his rescue collapse in the space of a single wet morning, all of it, he was certain, because of one grey, ungrateful daughter who had chosen a nameless, dying stranger over the survival of her own blood. He came to her that night. Illa was in the low fever room off the kitchens where the stranger now lay, his wound cleaned and dressed, the poison of it drawn with neem and heat, the fever broken at last into the deep grey sleep of a man who would, against every expectation, live. She had not changed out of the wedding crimson. There had been no time. She had worked in it for 18 hours until the gold thread was black with the man's blood, and her own hem was ruined past any mending. And this was how her father found her, kneeling in the wreck of the wedding he had sold her into, tending the very reason it had failed. He did not shout at first. That was the worst of it, that he did not shout. He stood in the doorway with a lamp and looked at her for a long moment, and Illa looked back and did not lower her eyes, and the silence stretched between them. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then Raja Jaswant said, in a voice scraped clean of everything but ruin, that she had destroyed them, that she had chosen a dog in the gutter over her own father and her own name, that she was not fit to carry the blood of Amargar, and that from this hour she did not. He disowned her there in the fever room doorway, formally, with the terrible calm of a man who has nothing left to lose, and means every syllable, casting her out of the family and the fort and the very name she had been born to, telling her to take her precious beggar and go, to see how far kindness carried her once the walls of her father's house were shut behind her. And Illa, kneeling, heard the whole of it, and did not weep, though her throat closed and her eyes burned, and every muscle in her body ached to break at last after 19 years of holding. She would not spend her tears on him. She rose instead, slowly, in her ruined crimson, and she said the last words she would ever say to her father under his own roof, that she was sorry for the debts, that she had loved him even when he could not see her, and that she did not regret the man on the pallet, because a life was a life, and she had been raised, though he had forgotten it, to believe that this was the whole of what any of them were worth. Then she gathered the few things that were truly hers, the grey sari, the granary ledger she could no longer use, a small bundle of dried herbs, and she walked out through the great gate into the last of the storm, and behind her she heard the doors of Amargar close, not with a slam, but with the soft, final, well-oiled certainty of a thing that would never open for her again. She had nowhere to go. She was a disowned woman in ruined finery on a mountain road in the rain, with a stranger too weak to walk. Sheltering in a herdsman's hut she had bribed with the last of her borrowed earrings, and by every measure the world understood, she had thrown her entire life away for nothing. And yet, as she sat in the doorway of that hut through the small hours, keeping watch over the breathing of the man she had saved, Illa felt something she hadn't felt in all her years of being useful and unseen, which was that for the first time in her life, she had done a thing that was entirely her own, chosen freely and paid for fully, and that whatever came of it, it belonged to no one but her. The man woke on the third day, and when he woke, he was not a beggar. Illa had suspected it already, in the way one suspects the shape of a submerged thing by the ripples it makes. His hands, once the fever cleaned them, were not a labourer's hands. They were scarred, yes, but scarred in the particular places a swordsman is scarred, and softer than they should have been for a man of the road. His fever talk, when it came, had been in the high court dialect, not the rough speech of the hills, and he had cried out names and numbers in his delirium, sums and grievances, the vocabulary of a man to whom betrayal had been done in ledgers as well as in blood. And when at last his eyes opened clear and found her sitting in her grey sari in the doorway of the herdsman's hut with the mountain light behind her, he studied her for a long, silent, evaluating moment. The moment of a man taking inventory, and then he asked her, in a voice made of stone and gravel, who she was and what she wanted for saving him, because in his experience, no one did anything without a price, and he preferred to know the price at once. Illa told him she wanted nothing. She told him plainly what had happened, the wedding, the gate, the fever, the disowning, all of it flat and without self-pity, and she watched his face while she spoke and saw that he did not believe her, that he was searching her account for the trick in it, the angle, the debt she meant to call in later. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he told her, grudgingly, as if the words cost him coin, that his name was Anant, of the house of Sirogar, and that until 11 days ago he had been the master of a fortress and lands 3 days' ride to the west, and that he was master of them still by right. Though not at present, in fact, because his cousin had put a slow poison in his cup and a knife in his back on the mountain road and left him for the crows, believing him dead, the better to seize the estate and the name and everything that came with it. He said all this in the flat, declarative way of a man reciting an inventory of losses he has already wept dry, and Illa understood that he had walked, poisoned and bleeding, for days, that he had been reaching in his fever, not for water, but for the sword they had taken from him, and that the wound on his shoulder was a betrayal wearing the mask of an accident. And then Anant of Sirogar looked at this plain grey woman who had ruined her own life to save the life of a man she believed to be a nameless beggar, and something moved behind his stone face that was not quite an expression, that was the almost of an expression, the ghost at the threshold of a feeling he had thought long dead, and he said slowly that she was not what he had expected. Over the days that followed, as his strength returned in the herdsman's hut, and Illa fed him broth and changed his dressings and asked him for nothing, a strange and unequal understanding grew between them, built not of warmth, for there was no warmth in him yet, but of a hard, mutual recognition. Two people the world had thrown away, recognizing the throwing in each other. And when at last he could stand, and then walk, and then look toward the west, where his stolen fortress waited, Anant made her the offer that would carry her into the second half of her life. He needed, he said, to reclaim what was his. But a man believed dead, appearing alone and poisoned and ragged, would be dismissed as an impostor or murdered outright before he reached the gate. He needed to arrive not as a beggar, but as a lord, with standing, with a household, with a wife of royal blood on his arm, whose very presence would silence the whispers and force the doubters to reckon with him. And she, he said, needed a roof, a name, a wall between herself and a world that ate disowned women alive. It was a bargain, nothing more, he was careful to say that, a contract between two ruined people for their mutual survival, with no softness owed on either side. He could offer her respect and safety and an honest accounting of what he expected. He could not offer her love, for he had none left to offer, having spent the last of it on people who had repaid it with poison. And Illa, who had already once weighed a marriage against a life and knew exactly how much a bargain was worth, looked at this cold, hard man with the almost of a feeling hidden behind his eyes, and thought that she had spent her whole existence being useful to people who could not see her, and that here at last was a man who at least saw her clearly, even if what he saw he called only useful, and she said yes. It was theft, in a way, what the world had done to both of them. And now they meant to steal something back. Sirogar, when she first saw it, was a house with no heart. They came to it at dusk after 3 days' hard travel, Illa in a fresh grey sari she had bought in a market town, Anont restored to the bearing of a lord by nothing more than a straightened spine and a borrowed sword, and the fortress rose against the darkening sky, like a thing carved out of the absence of warmth, a vast pile of black basalt with 100 windows, and not a single lamp burning in any of them. His cousin had held the place these 11 days, but the arrival of Anont alive, with a royal wife and a claim spoken loudly enough for the whole district to hear, had thrown the usurper into a confusion that bought them entry, for the servants remembered their true master, and the cousin dared not murder him openly in front of witnesses now that the district knew he lived. So the cousin retreated, snarling, to a wing of the estate and to the protection of the law he intended to bend, and Anant walked back into his own cold house with Illa at his side, and the great doors of Sirogar closed behind them the way the doors of Amargar had closed, except that this time she was on the inside of them, and the house she had entered was colder than any she had ever known. It was grand beyond anything Amargar had been, even in its glory, and it was dead. The halls were vast and echoing and swept clean of any human trace, the way a place is kept clean by people who take no joy in it. The great dining hall held a table so long that 2 people seated at its ends would have needed to shout, and Anant, she learned, ate at that table alone every night, at the very head of it, with the whole cold length of the wood stretching away from him into shadow, like a road to nowhere. There were no flowers. There was no music. The servants moved through the corridors like the memory of servants, silent, watchful, waiting to see whether this restored master would keep his life long enough to be worth serving. And in the beginning, they extended none of their loyalty to Illa, for she was a stranger and a bargain, and a plain grey woman with royal blood, but no beauty and no wealth. And the whispers ran ahead of her through the kitchens that the master had married a nobody out of desperation, a discarded daughter, a woman not even her own father would keep. Illa heard the whispers. She had spent her life hearing whispers. She did not answer them with words, because she had learned long ago that words were the weakest of all replies to contempt, and she answered them instead the only way she knew how, which was with work. She rose before the household. She learned the fortress the way she had learned Amargar, its granaries and its wells and its accounts, and she found them all in disorder, bled dry by the cousin's brief theft and neglected for years before that, by a master too consumed by his own grief and vigilance to notice that his house was quietly starving. She found the kitchen fires banked too low, and the grain stores mismeasured, and the well ropes rotting, and one by one, without announcement, she began to set them right. She did not command. She demonstrated. She did not scold the cook. She stood beside her at the fire until the woman, shamed, and then curious, and then grudgingly warmed, began to do things properly again. And slowly, so slowly that no single day showed the change, the dead house began to feel the pressure of a living hand upon it. The most powerful thing she did, and the thing that Anant noticed first, though he said nothing of it for weeks, was to the table. She could not bear that long, dead expanse of wood with a solitary man marooned at the head of it. And so one evening, she quietly instructed the servants to remove all but the nearest leaves of it, to shorten that road to nowhere down to a small square thing at which two people might sit close enough to pass a dish by hand. And she set 2 places at it, and when Anant came down to dine, and found his monstrous lonely table reduced to something human, with a plain grey woman sitting at the second place waiting to eat with him, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, he stopped in the doorway. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. And then, without a word, he sat down across from her, close enough to see her face by the single lamp, and he ate the first meal in yours that he had not eaten alone. If you are finding yourself drawn into Illa's quiet and stubborn courage, into this cold house that is only just beginning to remember what warmth feels like, take one small moment to subscribe before we go on, because stories like this one, of the overlooked and the underestimated finally being seen, are the stories I most love to tell, and I would hate for you to miss the ones still to come. Now let us return to Sirogar, and to the secret that lived at the top of its highest, coldest tower. For there was a part of the fortress Illa had not been permitted to enter, a locked stair at the northern end of the house that Anant himself climbed each night with a covered tray, and that the servants spoke of only in the lowering of their voices and the sign they made against ill luck. Illa had asked no questions. She had learned that a house keeps its secrets the way a wound keeps a splinter, and that the way to the splinter is patience, not force. But she watched, and she noticed, and she understood before he told her that whatever lay at the top of that stair was the true heart of Anant's coldness. The wound beneath the wound, the thing his cousin's poison had never been able to reach because it was already the most guarded thing he owned. The truth came on a night of hard frost, when Illa, unable to sleep, heard from the direction of the locked stair a sound that stopped her heart. The thin, exhausted, endless crying of a child in pain. She did not think. She was up the corridor and at the foot of the forbidden stair before she had decided to move, and she found the door at the top standing ajar, and within it a small, warm, firelit room that was the only warm room in all of Sirogar, and in the room a narrow bed, and on the bed a girl of perhaps 7 years, wasted and fever-bright, her small body twisted by an illness that had wrung her thin, and beside the bed, on his knees on the cold stone, the fearsome lord of Sirogar, holding his little sister's hand, and helpless, utterly helpless, a man who could face a poisoner's knife without flinching, brought low and shaking by a child's fever he did not know how to break. He looked up when Illa entered, and his face, for one unguarded instant, was not stone at all but naked terror, the terror of a man watching the last thing he loved slip through his fingers. And then he began, harshly, to order her out, to tell her this was not her concern, that she had bargained for a name and a roof, and not for this. But Illa was already at the bedside. She had seen this fever before, or its cousin. She had nursed it in the cold rooms of Amarga, and she put her hand to the child's forehead with the same plain competence she had put it to Anant's in the mud, and she began, quietly, to give her orders. Cool water, not cold. The window cracked, not shut, for the child was smothering under too many blankets, in a room kept too hot by a frightened brother. The neem, the honey, the willow bark she had seen in the kitchen stores. And Anant, who had spent 11 nights and a lifetime of guarded solitude, believing that no one in the world could help him carry this, watched a plain grey woman he had married out of desperation do in a single hour what all his wealth and all his fear had failed to do, which was to ease his sister's suffering, and to do it not as a bargain and not as a duty, but simply because a child was in pain, and she was there. The girl's name was Vasanti, he told her at last, in the grey hour before dawn, when the fever had loosened and the child slept at last in real sleep. She was all the family he had left. The poison plot against him had been meant to take her too, and he had hidden her in the tower, not out of shame, as the servants whispered, but out of a fear so total that he could not let another living soul near her, lest they be one more door through which harm could come. He had carried her alone because he had learned, in Blood and Poison, that everyone he trusted eventually became a wound. And now here was Illa, who had every reason to be another wound, who had married him for survival, and owed him nothing but the letter of a contract, sitting on the floor of the tower room, in the dawn light with his sleeping sister's hand in hers, having given more freely than anyone had given him in years. He did not thank her. He could not. The words were too large to fit through the narrow door he allowed his feelings. But he looked at her across the sleeping child, and the almost of a smile came to his stone face and stayed there a moment longer than it ever had before. And he said, low, that he had been wrong about her from the beginning, that he had expected a schemer and found instead the only honest person he had met in a decade, and that he did not know what to do with a thing he could not account for. And Illa, who did not weep, felt something come loose in her chest that had been held tight for 19 years, and she said only that he did not have to do anything with it, that she was simply here, and that he was not alone any more. After that night, the bargain between them quietly became something else, though neither of them named it, for they were both people who had learned to distrust the naming of good things, lest the naming break them. Illa was given the key to the tower, and she divided her days now between the healing of the house and the healing of the child, and under her patient hands the little sister Vasanti began, week by fragile week, to mend. The fevers grew fewer. The wasted limbs found a little strength. Illa carried the child out into the weak winter sun on the southern terrace, wrapped warm, and told her the names of the herbs she was reviving in the neglected beds there, and taught her small, useless, beautiful things, how to whistle through a folded leaf, how to tell a coming storm by the smell of the stone, and the sound that had never once been heard in cold Sirogar. The sound of a child laughing began to rise from the terrace and drift in through the 100 dead windows of the house like the first warmth of a changing season. And the house changed with the child. The servants, who had watched this plain grey stranger with folded arms, watched now with something closer to devotion, for they had all of them loved the little sister in silence and feared for her in silence. And here was the master's discarded wife, who had done what none of them had dared, and their whispers turned, as whispers do, and now they spoke of the Lady of Sirogar not as a nobody, but as the one who had brought the tower child back from the edge, the one who had made the master eat at a human table, the one whose grey sari moved through the black halls like the first grey light before a dawn. Puribai would have been proud, Illa thought, on the rare evenings she allowed herself to think of Amargar at all. She had brought no beauty to Sirogar and no wealth. She had brought only herself, her plain, competent, unglamorous self, and it was proving, to her own quiet astonishment, to be enough. And Anant watched all of it. This is the thing that must be understood, that the change in the house was nothing beside the change in the man, for the ice in Anant of Sirogar had been 10 years thick, and it did not crack all at once, but along 100 small fault lines, each one a moment he had not expected to feel. He found himself lingering at the shortened table after the meal was done, inventing reasons to keep her talking. He found himself climbing the tower stair in the evening, not out of dread now, but out of something like eagerness, to find his wife and his sister, with their heads bent together over a game of stones, the firelight on both their faces, and to be, for an hour, not a lord and not a survivor, but simply a man in the warm centre of his own small family. He found, one grey afternoon, that he had ordered his steward to have the ruined rose garden on the eastern wall cleared and turned, the garden his mother had loved, and that had died with her. And when Illa asked him why, he could not say the true reason, which was that he had seen her looking at it, and so he said gruffly that a great house ought to have a garden, and Illa, who saw straight through him as she saw through everyone, let him keep his gruffness, and only smiled. That was the season of the small gestures, the season the blueprint of their hearts was written in a language neither of them would speak aloud. He gave her his mother's shawl, the finest thing in the house, and said only that the tower was cold. She noticed that he never slept, that the poison and the betrayal had left him unable to close his eyes in a dark room, and so without a word, she took to leaving a small lamp burning in the corridor outside his chamber each night, and he never mentioned it, and it never went out. One evening, watching her hands as she wound a fresh dressing on a cut Vasanti had taken on the terrace, Anant said, in his flat stone voice, apropos of nothing, that when he had first offered her the bargain, he had told her he had no love left to give, that he had spent it all on people who repaid it with poison. Illa waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. And then he said that he had been mistaken about the amount he had left, and he did not look at her when he said it, and he did not say the word itself, but he did not need to, for Illa had spent her whole life learning to read the things that people could not bring themselves to say, and she read this, and she folded it away in the place where she kept the treasures no one could reach, and she went on winding the dressing with steady hands, and inside her, the changing season turned another degree toward spring. But the poison of Sirogar had never truly been drawn, only driven into hiding, and it had a face, and the face was beautiful. The cousin who had tried to murder Anant on the mountain road had not acted alone. He was the weak instrument of a stronger will, and that will belonged to a woman named Roshanara, the widow of Anant's late elder brother, a woman of such famous beauty that men rode 2 days to a festival merely to see her cross a courtyard, and of such famous coldness that none of them ever rode a 3rd day. She had married the elder brother for Sirogar, and been widowed young, and she had believed the whole of the estate would fall to her, and when instead it fell to Anant, she had woven a patient web of poison and paid cousins and whispered law to take it back, and Anant's return from the dead with a royal bride had torn her web but not destroyed her, for she was cleverer than the cousin and far more dangerous, and she did not make the mistake of striking with a knife a second time. She struck with words. She had learned quickly that this plain grey wife was the true engine of Anant's revival, that the district had begun to speak of the Lady of Sirogar with respect, that the servants loved her, and the sister lived because of her, and the cold master had begun, God help them all, to soften. And Roshanara understood, with the pure, clear instinct of the vein, that the surest way to destroy Anant now was to destroy Illa, and that the way to destroy a woman of no beauty and no wealth, whose only fortune was her good name, was to poison the name. So the whispers began, and they were subtle, and they were vicious, and they moved through the district like a stain spreading in cloth, that the Lady of Sirogar was no true princess, at all but a fraud, a servant girl dressed up in a stolen name to lend a poisoner's brother a false legitimacy, that she had not saved the beggar Anant out of kindness, but had conspired with him from the first, a schemer who had staged the whole tale of the wedding and the gate to worm her way into a fortress, that she was, even now, slowly poisoning the tower child in order to secure her own place as the only heir, that the child's illness was her doing, that the whole warm story of the healing was a mask over something monstrous. This last was the cruelest and the cleverest, because it took the very thing that was best in Illa and turned it inside out, and because it played upon Anant's oldest and deepest wound, his terror that everyone he loved would become another door through which harm could come. Roshanara did not tell these lies to Anant directly. She was far too skilled for that. She let them come to him sideways, in the pitying looks of neighbours, in a servant's overheard murmur, in the sudden silences when he entered a room. She let the doubt do its own work, knowing that a man who had been betrayed by everyone he trusted carries within him a readiness to be betrayed again, a wound that wants, in its sickness, to be proven right. And for a terrible span of days it seemed that it might work. Illa felt the chill return to the house, felt Anant's eyes on her with a new and dreadful weighing in them, felt the old walls going up again behind his face, and she did not know the shape of the poison, because no one would say it to her aloud, and she was too proud and too wounded to chase the whispers down. She only knew that the thaw had stopped, that the man who had almost said he loved her now would not meet her eyes, and that somehow, in some way she could not see, the old accusation of her whole life had followed her even here. The accusation that whatever she gave was not to be trusted, that whatever she was could not possibly be enough. And then the child fell ill again, a natural relapse of the old fever, the kind Illa had nursed her through twice before. And Roshanara, watching from the wing where she still coiled like a snake in a warm rock, saw her moment, and she took it. She let it be known, in the poisoned sideways way she had perfected, that the Lady of Sirogar had been seen with the child's medicine, that the relapse had come the very night after, that the pattern was now plain for any fool to read. And she prevailed upon the weaker minds of the district and the law court she had been bending, and upon Anant's own coiled dread to demand a public reckoning, a gathering of the district's noble houses at Sirogar itself, at which the truth of the lady, the fraud and the poisoner would be laid bare before them all. She had built, out of nothing but words and a wounded man's fear, a trap with Illa at the centre of it, and she had misjudged, as the vain always misjudge, only one thing. She had misjudged the servants, for while Roshanara had spent her days weaving whispers, Isla had spent her years earning something that no whisper could unweave, and when the noble houses gathered in the great hall of Sirogar, and the accusation was spoken aloud at last, it was not Illa who answered it. It was the cook who stood and said she had measured every dose of the child's medicine with her own hands, and that the lady had never once been alone with it. It was the old steward who produced the tower's ledger in Illa's plain, honest hand, every remedy recorded, every night accounted, the very opposite of a poisoner's secrecy. It was Puri Bai, come 3 days' road from Amagar, at the summons of a servant who loved her mistress, who told the whole district in her sharp black voice exactly what had happened at the gate in the storm, that there had been no scheme, only a girl who knelt in the mud for a dying stranger and lost everything for it. And it was little Vasanti, carried down into the hall, wrapped in her brother's mother's shawl, who looked at the beautiful cold woman and said, in her thin, mending voice, that her sister Illa was the one who made the fevers go away, and that everyone knew it, but the bad lady. The trap closed, but it closed on the one who had built it. Roshanara's web, made of nothing but words, dissolved the instant the truth was spoken, by mouths the district trusted, and she was cast out of Sirogar as she had tried to cast out Illa, into a world that had finally seen her clearly. And Anant crossed the length of that great hall before them all, and took his wife's plain grey hands in his scarred ones, and said the word at last, the whole word, out loud, because he had learned that some treasures break only when they are never spoken. And Illa, who had not wept in 19 years, finally, freely, spent her tears, and found them, at last, richly answered. If her story warmed you, stay with me. The next one is waiting.